filmmaker Ken Burns, who's had impact upon us all, not only from his unbelievable documentary film career, starting with the film he's talking about here, the Civil War, but also in his filmmaking techniques. I mean, it's in all the software called the Ken Burns effect. The ability to pan and scan in old photographs with narration, being able to be enough to grip a overloaded society of entertainment consumers. The man's proved himself brilliant. So these two episodes are from April 9th and 10th, 1991. Ken Burns and Later with Bob Costas.
Hi, and thanks for staying up later. A word of explanation here. In January, we were scheduled to run back-to-back shows with Ken Burns, the writer, researcher, cinematographer, producer, you name it, of the enormously successful series about the Civil War, which has won such acclaim after it appeared on PBS. We did show the first of those programs. It was delayed an hour because of coverage of the events in the Persian Gulf, and then the next night we were preempted. We feel that the shows should run back-to-back, so we're showing the first one again and then part two tomorrow night. And I began the first show by asking Ken Burns about his reaction to the wild acclaim about his production. And this young man from Walpole, New Hampshire, 37 years old, and for once I get to say that the guest looks younger than I do. I guess you've been getting that your whole life. You strike people as an unlikely person to have been the force behind a project that's received reaction like this.
10 years ago, I made a film on the Brooklyn Bridge, and every time I tried to raise money for it, they threw me out saying this kid is trying to sell me the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, I have not been able to go anywhere without having to sort of explain away my looks.
You had to know that you had a good piece of work on your hands when, after 5 years of effort from the bottom up, it finally came to fruition. But you couldn't have anticipated this kind of nationwide reaction to it.
It's the best kind of news. We had no idea. I literally went home the day of the broadcast explaining to my wife that we'd be able to take it easy for a while. And we have been answering mail that's piled up to the ceilings. We've had people visit us from around the country who, when the series was over, got in their cars and drove to our house just to say something to us. I've never written a letter about a show in my life. I don't know whether you have. I've gotten thousands of pieces, 5, 10-page letters saying this moved us like nothing else we'd ever seen.
We'll talk about the particular way that you went about researching it and shooting it in the second program. This is the first of two with Ken Burns. But let's find out a little bit about your motivation. I read a quote from you where you said, when most people hear history, they think castor oil. But I think about stories, and sometimes stories that can be told from the bottom up instead of the top down.
That's right. Well, the reason why history is so boring, the reason why it is castor oil that we hold our nose and take, is we think it's just some little subject that we have to deal with off in a corner, and then we have to learn some dates and memorize some very boring people and events and things like that, and leave it. History is anything but that. History is everything that has come before this moment. This moment. Everything. Our socks and where they came from, and that's what history is. And it's about not boring dates, but about people and emotions and feelings. His story. You tell the stories of history, which I've been interested in. So we've been taught that history is just great men. It's also from the bottom up, ordinary people, women, minorities, people who do the myriad heroic acts that make our lives possible.
And it turns out that many of those so-called ordinary people could be stunningly eloquent,
yes,
in expressing their feelings and in their observations of what was unfolding around them.
This was a war fought by the most literate populations on Earth, North and South, and just the letters themselves speak about a horror and a terror and a love of country, whatever country it was, a love of ideals unlike anything else. There's a really great moment when Shelby Foote, the on-camera commentator, says, before the war, Americans said the United States are, plural. After the war, they said the United States is, singular, ungrammatical. The war made us that is, and the transformation of us from an are to an is produced a tremendous amount of fighting and hatred and vindictiveness, but also a great deal of poetry, and that's what we try to listen for as well.
There's a letter from a man named Sullivan Ballou that plays an important part in the Civil War series, and he's writing to his wife, whose name was Sarah, as I recall.
Yes.
And he's speculating about the possibility of his dying in combat. And it is so moving. And this is a common man. This is not a general or an officer. He's a common man. And he says if this should happen, he'll regret not seeing his sons grow into honorable manhood.
Sullivan Ballou was killed a week later at the First Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the Civil War, and that letter has lived, blazed a trail in this country. We've been celebrating this collectively as a country over the last several months since the Civil War was broadcast, of the poetry and the poignancy of Sullivan Ballou, but I discovered that in the 19th century this letter was copied and passed around. We didn't have television, we didn't have fax machines, but someone knew back then that this was a letter to remember.
Trying to find some sort of focus here, and as I say, we could go off in 1,000 different directions for 100 hours and barely scratch the surface, but let's talk about some of the well-known warriors.
Yes.
What are the first few nuggets of information about Lee that come to mind?
The first thing, the associative thing, is that this is the marble man, the man that we really have difficulty getting close to in a real sense because he's been so smothered with the myth. This is a man who disapproved of secession and slavery, but went on to defend them both at the head of one of the greatest armies of all time, the Confederate Army. I mean, it's just an amazing story of a man who could fight in support of views that he didn't really agree with, but do it with such nobility and grace and genius, except for a few critical mistakes. And you have to understand Robert E. Lee as a man who made mistakes. Gettysburg is the greatest mistake of all time. As Shelby said, the price the South paid for having Robert E. Lee.
How about Lee's most obvious rival, Ulysses S. Grant?
Grant's really complicated. He is the person who epitomizes what the country is going to be. If Robert E. Lee is the nobility of Washington and Jefferson, with all the flaws there, the tolerance of slavery, the aristocratic, undemocratic side, but also the great purpose, then Grant is the bourgeois, the middle class, the man who is going to most define who's going to inherit the country. A Westerner, kind of rough, complicated, melancholy. I love Grant, and I think he doesn't get his due because he's always in the shadow of Robert E. Lee, the great, great, great general that he is. But Grant's magnificent as a general, really magnificent, I think.
In any sense, Lee's equal?
It's difficult to say. Shelby, I thought, in the series said it best. He said Lee's a great general because he took long chances, and he took long chances because he had to take long chances. Grant didn't have to. Grant just understood that he could just hammer away and eventually, because of the superiority, win, and that's what happened. But I do think when we say great, we also mean great men. And they're both great men, really great men. Grant, in some ways, surpasses Lee in some areas. Lee, of course, is still godlike Lee, but Grant's a remarkable character.
Although Grant had been something of a ne'er-do-well in other aspects of his life.
Oh, yeah, he was a failure in just about everything he'd done, heavy drinker, really had a drinking problem. In fact, Bruce Catton had a wonderful line in A Stillness at Appomattox. When they elevated Grant to the General-in-Chief, the head of the whole Union Army, they also elevated his best friend, John A. Rollins, as Chief of Staff, who had a mother-hen complex. And Catton said, here was the man who would save the man who would save the country. It was Rollins' duty to keep Grant from getting drunk. Simple as that.
One of the things that distinguishes the Civil War series throughout are the human touches that add to the bare-bone facts of what happened at a significant point in history. All right, so Lee, as we all know, finally surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. But the observations of those around the table and how neither Grant nor Lee betrayed much emotion, which might be disappointing to the viewer. You maybe expect that there would be some embrace or that someone would break down, but they didn't. But then, when Lee left the courthouse and the Union soldiers began to react, a great human moment occurred.
Well, they started to cheer. It was obvious. Here was this battle, this war that they had won. It was clear that they had won it. They defeated the man with the greatest military reputation since Alexander the Great, and they had just beaten him.
Let's continue with some of the major figures of the war. Stonewall Jackson.
He's wonderful. He's just as eccentric as you can get. He didn't eat pepper. He thought it would make his left leg ache. He would never mail a letter that he thought would be in transit on a Sunday. He is just a phenomenally complicated, wonderful, typically Southern character. I just think the world of him, and he is, of course, the scariest of Lee's commanders. He can really do it all. He's just a great fighter, you know. I love him.
Although Nathan Bedford Forrest was the guy that Sherman characterized as the most remarkable man the South produced, and in many ways a madman, right?
The war produced on either side, and he went the farthest. I wouldn't call him a madman. I just think he's one of the rare geniuses that wars produce, a man perfectly suited to this. He started off as a private, had been a slave trader before, among other things, and had made a huge fortune before the war. Started out as a private and became a major general, the farthest progression that anybody made in the Civil War, and drove Sherman and the Union Army in the West nuts. I mean, he's great, and in very much the same way as Stonewall Jackson.
Killed 31 men himself in hand-to-hand combat and escaped death so often you'd had to believe he had a charmed life.
Oh, and he undoubtedly did. I mean, he once drove into a group of Union men, found out that he was completely surrounded unexpectedly, and his officers were saying, "What do we do? What do we do?" And he says, "Divide in two and charge both ways." And they did, and he got out. I mean, it's just a magnificent moment. He's the one who said they get their firstest with the mostest. That's Nathan Bedford Forrest, which is just, as Shelby says, explaining in good sort of dialect what any military man knows: bring the most force to bear at the most important time.
And yet, in one man, in his own way, he embodies the contradictions and the ambivalence that you have to feel about many of the people involved and about the whole tone of the times. Because here's someone who had some qualities you could not help but respect, was tremendously courageous, principled in a fashion, and then was the first imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan 2 or 3 years after the conclusion of the war.
Yes, and quit when it's fair to say, when he felt the Klan was getting too violent. It's very easy to parse the Civil War into thousands of little parts in which we can conveniently excise those individuals and beliefs which we don't like. The series has been criticized by some on the extreme radical side in the South as being too pro-Union, and on the extreme radical side in the North as being too sympathetic to the South. This is a story about us. This is a family drama full of all the contradictions that we Americans are full of. And the primary contradiction of this country is that we were founded on the principle that all men were created equal, and yet we tolerated for 49 years the existence of chattel slavery. That's bad news, and out of that bad news we have many shades of gray. Nathan Bedford Forrest is a wonderful general, but certainly a shade of gray that we would find at least intolerable today. But that's true of almost everyone there. They split hairs. Lincoln was tardy on emancipation. Wendell Phillips called him a first-rate, second-rate man. But we have to embrace it. This is our family story. We're opening up an album of who we are.
Isn't there a present-day lesson to be taken from that? From those who take a narrow view now and think that Martin Luther King has been tarnished because we find out he was a human being and not a saint? And isn't it important that the most salient facts about Martin Luther King was that when the time presented itself, he answered what Lincoln called the better angels of his nature, and that is what defines him, that which made him unique, not failings which he shares with millions, but that where he transcended?
Where did we get in our mind? Maybe it's our fault in television that we have expected these kind of one-dimensional perfections out of our heroes. I rejoice in understanding frailty on the part of Abraham Lincoln, my favorite character, or Martin Luther King. Absolutely. What does it diminish to know this side? This is a man who, when called, responded in heroic fashion, who has left us a legacy that few of us will be able to even really appreciate. I agree completely. And bringing up King is a really good example coming out of the Civil War. He still, Martin Luther King fought in the Civil War too.
We continue now with Ken Burns, and this is one of these shows where I feel alternately exhilarated and frustrated because there's just no way we can cover all the ground, and so we'll skip over Antietam and we'll skip over Shiloh and we'll go right to Gettysburg, because if we do just one, obviously that's the one we'd want to focus on.
What can you say? The greatest battle in American history, I think. Its outcome affects the course of the war, but strangely it doesn't. The war is going to go on for another year and a half, though it should by all rights end. It's a blunder on the part of the South. It's a triumphant victory for the North. It coincides with the fall of Vicksburg, which happens the next day on the 4th of July, and essentially seals the fate. And in the midst of all of this story are the countless minor scenes and that defined us as a people, heroically. Besides Pickett's charge, I think of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's day on Little Round Top on the second day, July 2nd, where this college professor from Maine, at the extreme left of the Union Army, holds off a superior force and essentially turns the tide on that day, or helps to turn the tide on that day in heroic fashion, employing a little-known military textbook maneuver of a swinging gate to take his thinning ranks and sweep the Confederates off the field. This is one of the great heroic moments in American history, and it's at the Battle of Gettysburg.
When you visited Gettysburg to shoot, a technique that you used throughout was to shoot at the exact time of day or year. So you'd get position of the sun, you'd get the sounds of the crickets or the birds or whatever, so you, as closely as possible, recreate what it felt like. Knowing what you knew about the Civil War after all that research and about the Battle of Gettysburg, when you walked across fields where men had died, how did you feel?
Oh man, I stopped reading, first of all, about Gettysburg in the evening because I dream about it. If I went to bed with a book about the Civil War, I'd end up dreaming, half in and half out of battle, half directing it, half being a Cecil B. DeMille, half being a participant, unable to escape. But the first time I went to Gettysburg, I knew a lot about the battle. And I went up at the right time, and I was driving with a friend along the Emmitsburg Pike, and suddenly I stopped the car, realizing I was in the middle of Pickett's charge, and I got out and I ran the last quarter mile up to the true high water mark of the Confederacy, jumped over the top of the stone wall where Armstead had gone over and had been killed by the men of his best friend, Winfield Scott Hancock, and burst into tears, just burst into tears for all that was lost, for all that was gained, for all that we were, for the ghosts that were present at that moment. And I don't mean that in any kind of flip way. I feel there's a sympathy that we can gain with those who've gone before us. We have to have a sympathy for those. And if you're attuned, you can't help but be overwhelmed by the emotion. History doesn't really have much interest for me unless I know that there are emotions at the base, the ultimate base of what it is I'm attacking, whether it's the building of the Brooklyn Bridge or the most cataclysmic event in our history, the Civil War.
Back tomorrow night with talk of Abraham Lincoln, William Tecumseh Sherman, Jefferson Davis, and some of the techniques Ken Burns used in putting together the Civil War series. Until then, see you later. Thanks for staying up later. Ken Burns is back. He's the man behind the recently aired, much acclaimed, highest rated ever on PBS series about the Civil War, which airs again in January. We covered a lot of ground last night, and if you missed it, I'm sorry, we can't get you up to speed. We're just going to pick up where we left off with a few loose ends. We didn't talk about William Tecumseh Sherman very much, one of the most despised figures of the war.
I'm sorry about that too, because, and I understand though why in the South he's despised, but I think that the opprobrium heaped on William Tecumseh Sherman helps to obscure him, and he's really a phenomenal genius, the first modern genius of warfare, I think, in the modern age. He understood that the civilians and the industrial populations were the backers up of the army, and so he made war quite intentionally on the civilians, and that was revolutionary, and it worked. It destroyed the morale of the South, and they have not forgotten. But we forget how brilliant Sherman was. He's wonderful. He is brittle, nervous. He was almost retired permanently after the first year of the war, because he said it would take hundreds of thousands of men and hundreds of thousands of treasure and many years to win this war. And of course he was right. They thought he was insane. He even, the end of 1861, found him at home contemplating suicide in the care of his wife.
We were talking last night about all the little human touches that go beyond the major stories of history that help to make the Civil War series so compelling. And there's one vignette where a freed slave is fighting for the Union side, and they're somewhere in the South, and they come across a group of Confederate prisoners of war, and he comes face to face with his former owner, and he looks at him and he says, "Hello, massa, bottom rail on top this time."
It's exactly it. I mean, this is the story. I mean, war and the Civil War are made real by these myriad things. Sherman wore these little slippers, kind of like bedroom slippers, instead of the boots you'd expect of a great general. He was brilliant and fussy. He hated newspapermen. He said if he killed them all, there would be news from hell before breakfast, which I just thought was a magnificent statement, and true. That's how we can learn our history, is that. The bottom rail on top. We found a woman, 104 years old, lived near me in Vermont. I live in New Hampshire. She was across the river. She was the daughter of a slave who ran away, Daisy Turner. And Daisy Turner's father escaped from his plantation, joined the 1st Jersey Cavalry, came back, led his army back to his former plantation, and killed his overseer. Boom. I mean, that is just, I mean, that's what this war is about, too. The little town of Winchester, Virginia, changed hands 72 times during the war. John Crittenden of Kentucky could be proud of 2 sons who were major generals in the war, one for the North and one for the South. Can you imagine that? 2 generals of your sons. And that's what this is what this thing is about. Excruciating irony, coincidence, and sometimes intolerable poignancy. A diary of a Massachusetts volunteer was found after the Battle of Cold Harbor. He knew he was going to be killed the next day. That the charge, and in fact 7,000 Union men fell in 20 minutes in Grant's ill-fated charge of the entrenched Confederate position at Cold Harbor, Virginia. And the night before, Horace Porter, one of the commanding generals on the Union side, was horrified to find that his men were pinning their names and addresses to their tunics to aid in identification of their bodies the next day.
In addition to detailing the fighting from 1861 through 65, the beginning of the Civil War series sets the stage, frames the conflict. So there are frequent references to Frederick Douglass or to John Brown, the abolitionist. But the central figure throughout it all, obviously, is Lincoln. Walt Whitman was essential, for your purposes, in helping to define flesh Lincoln out, because Whitman, at the time, the most famous thing about Lincoln concerning Whitman is after his death, "Oh, Captain, my Captain."
Right.
But while he knew him, walking around Washington, D.C., Whitman saw greatness in the man, and even the way he described Lincoln's face, and the way his eyes were deeply set, and what he saw in those eyes, you could tell that Whitman realized he was in the presence of an extraordinary, transcendent man.
That's right. And he said one of the portrait painters, he said the current painters and photographers don't do it justice. He said what we need is one of the great portrait painters of a few centuries ago to capture this idiomatic Western genius that he saw etched in Lincoln's face. Lincoln, of course, being the first truly Western president coming from Illinois. And Whitman would see him at work. It's a great age in which one could wave to your president every morning on the way to work, and he would nod, and he would probably say, "Who is that guy?" "Oh, that's that Whitman character, the poet and nurse in the Army hospital."
And, of course, that fact makes it easy to understand why John Wilkes Booth was able, with relatively little difficulty, to make his way up the steps and into the back of the presidential box at Ford's Theater.
Right. This is the most horrendous moment in my mind in American history, because it took from us somebody that we needed to know even more about. I mean, I would have do anything to get another hour of Lincoln's life to have him talking. But Booth was an actor, came from a distinguished family of Shakespearean actors that had recently played, ironically, in Julius Caesar, which has an assassination in it. And he was able to slip into the back of Ford's Theater and wait for a pause, a laughter on the part of the audience watching this high Victorian drama, you know, Our American Cousin, Augusta dear, be gone, you know, footfalls, door slams, that sort of stuff, and waited for a line that would provoke a laugh. You sockdologizing old man-trap, the male lead says, and that broke everyone up in the 19th century. And he fired, and Lincoln belonged to the ages, as Stanton said, the Secretary of War said. It's an amazing moment.
It was so comparatively easy to get access to major governmental figures that had not a dull-witted accomplice of Booth's gotten cold feet, he might well have killed the Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Mr. and Mrs. Grant begged off going to Ford's Theater that night and instead went to Philadelphia. So Grant could have been killed, too.
Grant could have easily been killed. We would have
16th, 17th, and 18th presidents in one fell swoop.
Exactly. And it was very, very possible that that could have happened. And just Lincoln. Seward was wounded. The Secretary of State was wounded. But everybody else got away. Grant went to Philadelphia. It's an amazing moment in American history. There's none like it, the first president to be assassinated.
When you were putting together the scene where Lincoln is shot, you had to drop in the sound of gunfire. That was difficult for you, wasn't it?
It was the most powerful moment, I think, in the entire 5 years of production. We were in the sound mix, which is the very last creative process there is in this filmmaking business. And we had 20 or so soundtracks animating this play that was going on and all the different sounds. And we laid them down, the narration, the music, the play. And we're now going back to pick up the appropriate sound of the bullet. And it's $500 or $600 an hour in a big mixing studio, which we can barely afford on our tiny budget. And all of a sudden, the editor just turns around as we're heading for this moment, inexorably for this moment when the bullet will go off and we'll lay down. He looks at me, and I realize the moment, and my assistant, associate producer, looks up, and I just yelled, "Stop!" And the mixer hit the button, and everything ground to a halt, right, stopping just before the sound of this bullet. And for a few expensive moments, we sat there and kept Abraham Lincoln from being killed. And it was an amazingly powerful moment. We had tears streaming down our cheeks, and we finally just sort of ended the dream, and that's what it was, the reverie, and backed the thing up, laid down the shot, finished the film.
Let's talk about some of the people who contribute to the film. David Mccullough, the narrator. His voice has a little bit of a John Chancellor quality to it. I'm sure a lot of people have made that comment.
Yeah.
But I think that he made, or you helped him make, a very good decision, which was this material is so powerful that if you just present it,
that's right,
not matter-of-factly, but with professional skill, it will carry itself.
Exactly.
And there is no need to dramatize this or embellish it in any way. And so he, at points, tosses off some of the most remarkable bits of information almost matter-of-factly.
That's right. The most difficult task is to be invisible, and David Mccullough was invisible. He's not a performer. He's not giving a performance. He's giving the meaning of the words, and because he's a historian first and a hell of a great writer, he knows what he's talking about. He's not learning it like a role or reading it like an announcer. He knows it, and that meaning gets to you, gets to me, and helps tell that story, a very difficult story, better than anybody else. He's an unsung hero of the Civil War.
The voices of the characters, too many to even begin to touch on, and we'll just slight those we don't get to. George Plimpton is in there, and Pamela Reed does many Southern voices.
I'm glad you mentioned her. She's phenomenal. She would say, "What state? How old? Rich or poor?" And then she'd do it. She was wonderful. And Frederick Douglass, read by Morgan Freeman. I mean, this man sent chills up and down my spine just hearing it in the editing room. I've heard these 100 times. Sam Waterston, knowing how to read the Gettysburg Address.
Well, that was the one I was going to get to. Garrison Keillor is another we should probably mention. He's in
Jason
there.
Robards, Julie Harris.
Jason Robards, Julie Harris.
Paul Roebling is Sullivan Ballou, and more prevalent than any other voice.
But Waterston, as Lincoln, understood a couple of things. One, although we might prefer that he did, Lincoln did not have a rich baritone voice.
That's right.
Secondly, the cadence and the emphasis on the reading of the Gettysburg Address. Yes. Everybody, when I was Lincoln in the 6th grade play,
right.
And they told me to say, government of the people, for the people, and by the people. And I was supposed to bring my hand down on of, for, and by, and the people was kind of tossed off.
That's
but
right.
That's not the way Lincoln did it.
And Lincoln said it, and we know he said, and this is what it was about. He was moving it to a different thing. This is about the survival of popular government, of democracy. Not this old aristocracy, but the new order, where all men are truly created equal. So the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from this earth. Changes the whole meaning. The Gettysburg Address is no longer cliched. And when we say 7 years ago, we think that's the way everybody talked back then. No, he was trying to find a new way of reminding his audience how young his country was. How do you do that? How do you say, come on, guys, this is a generation. Our fathers formed this country, and unless we hang on to it, it's going to disappear in the next generation. So he said, 70, you know, it's only a short time ago that our country was founded.
But he didn't think that the speech had been that well received, apparently, because they didn't erupt in applause, so he just kind of sat down.
Well, it was short. The photographer even didn't get the shot off, and he sort of sat down to a smattering of sort of polite applause that the office had, and he turned to his friend Ward Layman, and he said, that speech won't scour, that's what you say, when dirt doesn't come off a plow in the prairies. It just wouldn't work. And the Chicago Times said, the cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States. And you go, this is the Gettysburg Address, the most famous speech ever given in the English language. And
you know, I imagine a lot of people, it's getting close to 2 o'clock, they're trying to picture me in the 6th grade as Lincoln. And the truth of the matter is that they pasted with some kind of epoxy, they pasted this beard onto my face. And even then, with a stovepipe hat, I didn't look that much like Abe Lincoln, which is also shocking. But this is the best part. We played a school softball game after the Flag Day play, and my mom and the school nurse could not get the beard off my face. And so I played shortstop in the game.
Like the House of David.
Just what I was going to say, like I was in the House of David. I had a baseball cap on, but I looked like I'd had a weird hormonal spurt, and I had grown a beard at the age of 11. Maybe you've said it before in various ways as we've talked, but what was your personal motivation? You could not have known that there would be this sort of payoff in terms of public reaction. There certainly wasn't a financial pot of gold, relatively speaking, at the end of the trail here. What was your motivation to devote 5 years of research and production and work, and it's the most meticulous kind of work, just for the sake of saying, there it is, and if nobody watches it, I did it, and it's there?
Partly that's it. Partly a desire, and I've been trying to excavate something in my work. All my films have been about American history. Sometimes we get distracted by the subjects, even by the Civil War. We're distracted by the subjects. The intention is to touch something that we can say is distinctly American, can be who we are, can be a mirror of who we are. That's what I'm looking for. The Civil War presents, it seems to me, the clearest and most distinct mirror of who we are as a people. And I went after it just because I wanted to know a little bit more about who we are.
Accordingly, your next couple of projects, although nothing can compare in American history to the scope and importance of the Civil War, they're consistent with what interests you. Subjects that speak to a part of our shared history.
Yes.
One is the history of radio, and the other is one that's related in a way to radio.
Yes,
Baseball and radio will always be linked in a way that I think most baseball fans truly understand, at least most baseball fans past the age of 30 understand.
For the careful viewers of the Civil War series, deep in Episode 7, late in the year 1864, there is a moment at Fort Pulaski outside Savannah where we show an impatient Union Army waiting to be relieved by a larger Union Army so they can go and take the city of Savannah. To while away their hours, they begin to play this new game, which is fast catching on across the country, called baseball. Baseball is the mirror that I'm looking for the last century and a half. If the Civil War is the mirror in a concentrated dose of who we are as a people and those 4 terrible years, then baseball is a rather, for the most part, but not always, joyous mirror of who we are as a people for the last 150 years. And this is what I'm trying to understand and pursue right now. And I promise we'll lift up the rug of history and show some of the dirt and the more disappointing aspects. But ultimately, this is a divine comedy, a wonderful, wonderful story, and I think equally as revealing of us as a people as the Civil War was. The young men are now out playing in the fields rather than lying bloated and dead in it, and that, for me, will be a wonderful refreshment. But
how long will it take?
I think about 4 years. We are the sort of the Paul Masson of documentary film companies. You know, we will sell no documentary film until it's done, and we want to do it right.
To Ken Burns for these 2 programs. We jammed in as much as we could. Ken has promised to come back in the near future. We'll talk then at greater length about Shelby Foote, who really was a star, I guess is the way to put it, of the Civil War series and the upcoming projects on radio and baseball. Thanks for being here, and thanks for giving us the Civil War series.
Thank you.
We'll see you.
That's the rebel yell.